At my father's funeral, my stepmother, Vivian, leaned across the white lilies and whispered, "You get nothing." Her hand on my arm felt like a final sentence, while relatives offered their condolences with pitying stares. 5 minutes later, my father's lawyer slipped through the pews and pressed a set of keys into my palm. The red tag attached read, "Estates." I suddenly realized the funeral wasn't the end. It was the opening move in a war I didn't know he'd prepared me for. My name is Maureen Cole. I am 33 years old and I am standing beside a photograph of a dead man I once called Dad. The air in Grace Hollow Church is thick and cold. A damp November chill that the ancient, rattling HVAC unit can't seem to conquer. It's a place built for stoic New England grief, all dark wood and austere stained glass that turns the weak, rainy light into bruised shades of purple and blue. Outside, a persistent drizzle slicks the streets of Ridgefield Oaks. Each drop against the glass a tiny, rhythmic tap accompanying the mournful drone of the organ. The music swells and fades, but the wheezing groan of the air conditioner is constant, an industrial death rattle that undercuts the solemnity of the hymns. The air smells of old hymnals, wet wool coats, and the funereal sweetness of lilies, an army of them, white and waxy, banked around the polished mahogany casket. The man in the portrait is Harold Cole, founder and CEO of Northbridge Meridian Logistics. The photo is from 5 years ago, taken for a feature in a business journal. He's in his prime, his hair still more steel than silver. His eyes alight with the sharp, calculating intelligence that could map out a 3-state supply chain on the back of a cocktail napkin. He looks powerful, indomitable. He looks nothing like the man who faded away in a sterile white room, tethered to machines that beeped a slow, reluctant goodbye. Standing here, I feel a familiar, hollow ache. It's the grief of losing 2 fathers, the titan in the photograph and the quiet, tired man he became. Across the casket, my stepmother Vivian holds court. She's a masterpiece of calculated mourning. Her dress is a sheath of black silk that whispers of its expense with every slight movement. Black lace gloves cover her hands, a theatrical touch that keeps the world at a polished distance. Her face, framed by a severe, elegant hat, is a mask of serene sorrow. But her smile, when it briefly flickers on for a sympathetic parishioner, never comes close to reaching her eyes. Those eyes are chips of ice, constantly scanning, assessing, managing the room, as if it were a quarterly board meeting. The pastor invites us to bow our heads for a moment of silent prayer. A collective rustle of fabric, a soft shuffling of feet, and then a heavy quiet punctuated only by the organ and the wheezing vent. It's in this sacred, manufactured silence that Vivian makes her move. She leans towards me, her body gliding over the crest of lilies, separating us, a predator closing in. Her perfume, a suffocatingly strong gardenia, arrives first, a chemical cloud that invades my space and steals the air from my lungs. "You get nothing," she whispers. The words are not angry. They are calm, precise, and absolute. A statement of fact delivered with the chilling finality of a judge's gavel. They slice through the sanctimonious quiet, a shard of ice pressed against my heart. I don't move. I don't even breathe. My eyes are closed. My head bowed like everyone else's, but behind my eyelids, the darkness is swirling. The grief I've been holding so tightly in my chest, a compressed ball of pain, is suddenly eclipsed by a stunning, crystalline shock. The prayer ends. As heads lift, I risk a glance around the pews. My Aunt Catherine meets my gaze for a fraction of a second before her eyes dart away, finding a sudden intense interest in the floral arrangement to her left. My cousin Richard offers a weak, watery smile that is an apology and an admission of his own powerlessness. They heard nothing, but they know everything. Their silence is their vote, their allegiance sworn long ago with polite nods at family dinners, and quiet acceptance of Vivian's iron-fisted rule over the Cole dynasty. They are silent accomplices. And then there's Dane, my half-brother, Vivian's son. He's sitting in the front row, the very picture of grieving air. His suit is impeccably tailored, his sorrow perfectly modulated for public consumption. But as he glances back at me, his eyes hold no sympathy. They hold a gleam of pure, unadulterated victory. It's a quick, dismissive look, the kind a king gives to a courtier he is about to have removed. He saw his mother lean in. He knows what she said. His expression confirms it. The game is over, and they have won. My mind flashes back to an email that arrived at 11:47 last night. The sender was Kellen Marsh, my father's law firm. The subject line was stark, regarding the estate of Harold T. Cole. The body was brief, devoid of any sentiment. The formal reading of the will is scheduled for next Tuesday, at our offices. Please confirm your attendance. At the time, it felt like a cold, procedural coda to a life. Now, Vivian's whisper has turned it into a threat, the ticking of a clock counting down to my official dispossession. Someone's hand lands on my shoulder, a heavy, paternalistic pat. It's Uncle Robert, my father's brother. His face is a jumble of well-intentioned sadness. Be gracious, Maureen, he murmurs, his breath smelling of coffee and mints. Whatever Harold decided, you must be gracious. Be gracious. The words are meant to be comforting, a piece of wisdom from an elder. Instead, they feel like a command to accept my own erasure with a polite smile. I am to be the good daughter, the quiet one, the one who doesn't make a scene. I nod, a jerky, puppet-like motion, and swallow against the hard, jagged stone that has formed in my throat. The service concludes. The organ plays a final, samba recessional. People begin to file out, their hushed condolences and sympathetic touches feeling like the brush of ghosts. I remain rooted to my spot, a statue of black wool and compressed emotion. Vivian is already surrounded, accepting hugs, her lace-gloved hand dabbing at a perfectly dry eye. That's when I see him. Thomas Marsh, my father's personal lawyer, is moving against the current of mourners. He's a man in his late 50s, tall and thin, with a face that seems incapable of expressing anything other than discreet professionalism. He isn't here as a friend. He's here as an executor of duties. He bypasses my aunt, ignores Dane, and heads directly for me. He doesn't offer platitudes. He doesn't say he's sorry for my loss. He simply gets close, his presence a shield against the pitying glances, and his hand moves with practiced subtlety. Maureen, he says, his voice a low baritone that cuts through the ambient noise. And then I feel it, the cold, solid weight of metal being pressed into my palm. My fingers instinctively curl around it. I look down. It's a set of keys, not a car key or a house key. This is something different. There are 3 of them on a simple steel ring. One is a sleek modern key card, white plastic with the Northbridge Meridian logo, and the labeled Northbridge 51F. The second is a heavy, old-fashioned steel key, the kind for a safe deposit box or high-security lock, stamped with a simple S9. The third is a standard office key, but it's the tag attached to it that catches my eye. A small rectangular tag of bright red plastic with one word engraved in white, Kestrel. I look up at Marsh. My confusion a silent question. He leans in closer, his voice barely a whisper meant for my ears alone. He wanted you to have these, specifically here, at the funeral. The emphasis is unmistakable. This wasn't an afterthought. This wasn't part of the will reading next week. This was a deliberate, strategic act. A message sent from beyond the grave, designed to be received in this exact moment. In this room full of enemies disguised as family, a current, hot and sharp, runs up my arm. The cold weight of the keys in my hand is an anchor in the swirling sea of grief and shock. I make a fist. The jagged edges of the steel key dig into my skin, the feeling grounding me. My gaze lifts, sweeping across the emptying church, and finds Vivian. She is watching us. Her conversation has stopped, her head tilted slightly. Her perfectly composed face registers a flicker of something new. It's not anger or pity. It's confusion, then suspicion as she recognizes Thomas Marsh. Her eyes drop to my hand, to the fist I have made around the keys. She can't see what I'm holding, but she saw the exchange. She saw the lawyer's clandestine movement, the transfer. And for the first time in the 15 years I have known her, I see a crack in Vivian's flawless porcelain facade. A tiny, almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes, a faint, downward twitch of her lips. It's not just a wrinkle born of age. It's a line of sudden, sharp anxiety. It's fear, raw and unmistakable. In that silent, charged glance across a room filled with wilting lilies and fading hymns, the world shifts, her whispered ultimatum no longer seeming like a declaration of war, but a desperate attempt to secure her victory. You get nothing still hangs in the air, but the cold, heavy reality in my hand whispers back a promise of its own. The funeral was her opening salvo. These keys are my father's response. The keys are cold in my coat pocket, a jagged weight against my thigh as I drive away from the reception. I didn't stay long, just enough time to accept a few more empty condolences, and watch Vivian orchestrate the performance of grief, her hand resting proprietorially on Dane's arm. The perfect family, shattered by loss, but united in sorrow. It's a beautiful lie, one they have spent 15 years perfecting. My father, Harold Cole, was not born into the world Vivian now inhabits. He built his empire, Northbridge Meridian Logistics, from a single rusted-out shipping container and a leased patch of gravel near the port. I remember that yard. I remember the smell of diesel and salt, the grit of the dirt under my fingernails, the way his hands, calloused and stained with grease, could fix anything from a flat tire to a broken-down generator. He spoke the language of logistics, bills of lading, freight classes, intermodal transit. It was a world of hard numbers and tangible results. A world that made sense. Then my mother got sick, and the world stopped making sense. After she was gone, a silence fell over our small house. A silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence. Into that silence walked Vivian. She was a consultant my father had hired to help with corporate branding. She rebranded him first. The grease-stained work boots disappeared, replaced by polished Italian leather. The simple dinners at the kitchen table became catered affairs with linen napkins and multiple forks. Our house, once a place of comfortable clutter, was gutted and redesigned into a minimalist showcase of beige and glass, a sterile, silent testament to her impeccable taste and my father's expanding fortune. It ceased to be a home and became a venue, a stage for the presentation of power. Everything from the art on the walls to the embossed letterhead on the stationery was curated to project an image of effortless old money class that we had no claim to. Vivian didn't just marry my father, she acquired him and his company as her ultimate restoration project. I never fit into her new design. I was a relic of the previous administration, a reminder of the gravel yard and the calloused hands. I tried to find my own way to build something that was mine alone. I studied business, specializing in corporate compliance and risk management, the unglamorous back end of the business world that was all about rules and accountability. I was good at it. I landed a job at Westwood Freight, a respectable mid-level competitor to Northbridge. I worked my way up, earning a reputation for being meticulous, foreseeing patterns in data that others missed. After 7 years, I made manager of the audit department. It wasn't an empire, but it was mine. I had a corner office, a small team, and a sense of pride in my own competence. Then, 6 months ago, I was downsized. The term itself is a masterpiece of corporate cowardice. It sounds so clean, so impersonal, like a minor software update, but it feels like a personal failing, a public branding of your own inadequacy. My boss, a man who had praised my work just weeks before, couldn't meet my eye as he read from the HR script about restructuring and synergies. The timing was exquisite. The announcement of my termination came in the same week that Vivian sent out a lavish, telegraphed announcement for Dane's engagement to the daughter of a banking magnate. My failure was the perfect drab backdrop to their sparkling success. I remember a conversation with Vivian a few years ago, at one of her suffocatingly elegant Christmas parties. I'd been explaining a complex regulatory issue I'd untangled at Westwood. She'd listened with a patient, faintly bored smile before placing a cool hand on my arm. "You're so very clever with the details, Maureen," she'd said, her voice a soft purr. "You're better suited to a backstage role. I think every production needs a good stage manager." The compliment was a dismissal. A stage manager is essential, but invisible. Her message was clear: my place was in the shadows, out of the spotlight that belonged to her and her son. My father's love was a quieter, more complicated thing. He never openly defied Vivian, never challenged her subtle campaign to marginalize me, but he communicated in his own way. He would send me books, biographies of industry titans, or dense tomes on corporate law. Inside, I'd find entire paragraphs underlined in his distinctive, heavy-handed pencil strokes. He never added notes, just the lines themselves. Again and again, the underlined passages would be about one thing: fiduciary duty, the legal and ethical obligation of a director to act in the best interests of the company above their own. At the time, I thought he was just trying to further my education. I see now he was trying to teach me a language, to give me a weapon for a war he knew was coming. He could never speak ill of his wife, but he could damn sure teach his daughter about the responsibilities of the people running his company. After I was let go from Westwood, I swallowed my pride and applied for a position at Northbridge. It was a lateral move in their internal audit division. I was overqualified, but I needed the work. And a small, foolish part of me thought it might be a way to reconnect with my father, to re-enter his world through the professional door since the personal one had been so thoroughly guarded by Vivian. The rejection was swift and clinical. An email from Vivian's head of HR, a woman she'd brought in from a fashion conglomerate, informed me that my application could not be considered due to a clear conflict of interest. It was a perfect corporate checkmate. I was too close to be an employee, but not close enough to be family. That feeling is perfectly captured in the official family portrait that hangs at the top of the grand, curving staircase Vivian had installed. It was taken 2 years ago. Vivian is the undeniable center of the composition, seated, radiant in an emerald green dress. My father's hand resting on her shoulder. Dane stands beside her, looking every bit the heir apparent. I am on the far edge of the frame, standing slightly behind my father. The photographer, a man Vivian had flown in from New York, took dozens of shots. The one she chose, the one she had framed in ornate gold leaf, is the one where a flash caught me at the exact moment I blinked. There I am, preserved for all time in the family pantheon, blurred, indistinct, my eyes closed to the brilliant future they are all gazing toward. The last time I saw my father alone was about a month before the end. I'd found him in his study, the one room in the house that still felt like him, smelling of old leather and paper. The illness had taken its toll. He was thin, his voice a reedy version of its former confident baritone. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, the weather, a problem with my car. Then, out of the blue, he looked at me with a strange intensity. "Maureen," he said, "that old safe deposit box at the downtown bank, the one your mother opened. Do you still have the key?" The question was so random, so out of context, that it threw me. It was a box my mother had kept for personal papers, one I hadn't thought about in over a decade. "No, Dad," I'd said, searching my memory. "I think the bank returned everything after her estate was settled. I don't know what happened to the key." A profound weariness settled over his features. He just nodded slowly and breathed out a long, quiet sigh. It wasn't a sigh of sadness. I realize now it was a sigh of frustration, of a plan hitting a snag. For months, I have carried the weight of these moments as personal failures. My career stalled, my place in my own family erased. My final conversation with my father, a confusing dead end. I believed the narrative Vivian had so carefully crafted, that I was the awkward, backstage daughter who simply couldn't measure up. I thought the game was rigged against me because I wasn't good enough to play. But as I sit here in my car, parked on a quiet side street blocks from the church, the cold, hard reality of the keys in my pocket tells a different story. Northbridge 51F. S9. Kestrel. These are not random objects. They are pieces of a puzzle my father left behind. Vivian's fear was not just suspicion. It was the recognition of a contingency plan she never knew existed. My father wasn't weak. He was trapped in a marriage he couldn't or wouldn't escape. But he wasn't passive. He was preparing. The books, the underlined passages, the question about the key. They were all part of a long, silent strategy. He wasn't just watching me fail. He was watching his enemies reveal their methods. The humiliation of my downsizing, the sting of the HR rejection, the casual cruelty of Vivian's whisper over the lilies. It all clicks into place, not as a verdict on my worth, but as moves on a chessboard I couldn't see. My father saw it, though. He saw the entire board. I pull the keys from my pocket. The red tag, Kestrel, seems to glow in the dim light of the car. I have no idea what it means, but it feels like a call to arms. All my life, I've played by the rules. I've been gracious. I've stayed backstage. But the silent, heavy keys in my hand feel like a permission slip, a posthumous directive from the man who built an empire on a gravel lot. The game isn't over. It has just been reset. The faint sound of the funeral bells fading in the distance sounds less like an ending and more like the ring that signals the start of a new round. And for the first time, it's my turn to move. Grief is a patient animal. It had been sitting quietly in the passenger seat all day. But now, as I drive through the deserted streets of the financial district, it begins to stir. The city is slick with rain. The streetlights bleed across the wet asphalt. It's the night after the funeral, just past 11, and the world has gone quiet. Ahead, the Northbridge Meridian Tower rises into the low-hanging clouds, a 55-story monolith of dark glass and steel. Its top floors lost in the mist. It's my father's monument. His legacy. And I'm beginning to suspect his crime scene. I pull into the executive parking garage, the gate lifting silently after a brief hesitation over my unfamiliar car. The air inside is cool and still, smelling of concrete and exhaust fumes. I park in a visitor's spot and walk towards the glass doors leading to the lobby. Inside, a lone security guard sits behind a vast marble desk, watching a small television. He looks up as I approach, his expression shifting from boredom to mild suspicion. He's younger than the day shift guards I remember. "Can I help you, miss?" I hold up the white key card. "Marin Cole. I have an appointment on 51. It's a lie, but a plausible one. He squints at the card, then at my face. "Don't have anyone on the list for tonight. It was arranged by Thomas Marsh." "From Kellen Marsh," I say, my voice steady. "For my father, Harold Cole." My father's name is the only key that matters. The guard's posture softens. He knows who Harold Cole was. He gestures towards the turnstile. "Right. Sorry for your loss, Ms. Cole. Go on ahead." The turnstile accepts the card with a dry, electronic beep. The sound is stark and final in the cavernous, silent lobby. I cross the polished floor, my footsteps echoing like gunshots, and call an elevator. The ride to the 51st floor is silent and swift. My stomach drops as the numbers climb. This high up, the tower is a ghost ship, staffed only by janitorial crews and the hum of its own electronic nervous system. The doors slide open onto a small, private lobby. The air is different here. Filtered, sterile. There are no desks, no cubicles, just a few severe leather chairs and a single unmarked door. The key card works here, too. Another BIP, and the lock clicks open. The room is not an office. It's small, windowless, and dominated by a single conference table and a large monitor on the wall. There is one window, a floor-to-ceiling plate of glass that takes up the entire far wall, offering a god's eye view of the city. Down below, the highway is a river of red and white lights. The cars move like blood cells through the veins of the metropolis. The rain streaks down the glass, distorting the view, making the world outside seem distant and unreal. In the corner of the room, almost hidden in the shadows, is a heavy, gunmetal grey safe embedded into the wall. Stamped into the steel door is a small, neat inscription, S9. My heart hammers against my ribs. I pull the heavy steel key from my pocket. It feels impossibly old and solid in my hand. It slides into the lock with well-oiled precision. I turn it. There's a series of deep, satisfying clicks from within the door. As the tumblers align, I pull the handle, and the heavy door swings open with a soft whoosh of displaced air. The inside is small, barely a cubic foot, and sparsely populated. There are only 2 items. The first is a simple black USB flash drive, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. A piece of masking tape is wrapped around it with one word written in my father's blocky, all-caps handwriting, Kestrel. The second is a thick, cream-colored envelope of heavy bond paper. My name is on the front, also in his hand, to Murrin upon my death. The ink is slightly feathered, as if he'd pressed down hard. My hands are shaking as I pick up the envelope. I tear the seal. Inside is a single sheet of his personal letterhead. The Northbridge logo embossed at the top. The letter is short. The sentences are packed with a terrible urgency. Murrin, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and things are as I feared. I am sorry for the silence. I am sorry for not being the father I should have been these last years. I was fighting a battle I could not win in the open. Kestrel was the name of the internal audit project you ran at Westwood Freight 5 years ago. The one on fraudulent vendor billing. You thought I didn't know about it. I knew. I read the case study you published in the trade journal. Use what I have left you. It is all the explanation I can offer and all the weapon you will need. I read the note 3 times, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. He knew all that time. I thought he was oblivious, absorbed in his new life with Vivian. But he had been watching, paying attention to the details. I thought no one, least of all him, would ever notice. Kestrel. The name wasn't random. It was a signal, a message of faith in the work I had done, in the person I was. Wiping my eyes with the back of my hand, I turn to the monitor and plug in the USB drive. It boots up instantly. There is no password protection. The drive contains only a handful of files, each with a simple numerical name. I open the first file, 01writerk.pdf. It's a contract addendum. A rider to a master supplier agreement. The language is dense legalese, but the title is clear, Supplier Integrity Clause. I scroll past the boilerplate to the signature page. 3 signatures are at the bottom, all dated 18 months ago. Vivian's is first. A flamboyant, theatrical script above the title. Dane's is next. An arrogant, upward slanting scroll, Dane Grant, VP of Operations. And last is my father's. Harold T. Cole, CEO. His signature is a firm, no-nonsense line, a physical assertion of his authority. I feel a chill as I realize what I'm looking at. A trap, signed and dated by the very people it was meant to catch. I click on the second file, 02payments.xlsx. An Excel spreadsheet opens. Its columns filled with sterile numbers. The data tracks wire transfers from a vendor named Bridalhawk LLC to a recipient entity called V-Grant Holdings. The payments are for logistical consulting, and they are substantial, tens of thousands of dollars, occurring like clockwork on the 15th of every month for the past 2 years. V. Grant, Vivian Grant, Dane Grant. It's a shell corporation, a ghost company set up to launder money right out of Northbridge's accounts. Bridalhawk, I realize, must be one of their approved vendors, grossly overbilling and kicking back a portion of the profits. The third file is a video, 03traininginternal.mp4. I double-click, and the screen fills with the image of a conference room. A younger, cockier Dane stands in front of a whiteboard. All right, everyone, listen up, he says, a smug grin on his face. We are not calling it double billing. We are calling it optimized lane billing. When a federal shipment is routed through a secondary sorting hub, we bill for the initial leg, and then the optimized leg separately. It's a value-added service. One of the junior employees in the video looks confused. But isn't that billing twice for the same shipment? Dane laughs. You're not paid to think. You're paid to file the paperwork as you're told. Just follow the procedure. It's the smoking gun. A training video for fraud, starring the Vice President of Operations. My hands feel like ice. The fourth file is an image, 04 email VG. It's a screenshot of an email. The sender is Vivian Grant. The recipient is Dane Grant. The subject, audit. The message is brutally simple. That Westwood woman is sniffing around the Bridalhawk accounts. Clear this before the quarterly audit. Use the K flag to bury the invoices in the legacy system. Handle it. The K flag. The Kestrel flag. Handle it. The K flag. The Kestrel flag. She wasn't just complicit. She was directing the cover-up. The Westwood woman must have been one of my old colleagues, someone I had trained using the very methods I had developed. The final file is a text document, 05 instructions.txt. It's from my father, Marin. The new federal infrastructure contract is worth $1.2 billion to this company. The signing is imminent. Vivian and Dane are counting on it. They believe it is their coronation. When the signing is scheduled, you will present this evidence along with Ryder K directly to the independent members of the board of directors. Do not go through internal channels. Do not warn anyone. Ryder K contains a clause I wrote myself. It stipulates that in the event of proven insider supplier fraud, all voting rights held by the implicated parties are temporarily transferred to an independent, pre-designated beneficiary to ensure the stability of the company during the crisis. I designated you as that beneficiary. This will give you control. Use it to clean my house. My breath catches in my throat. It's all here. A meticulous, posthumously executed corporate coup. He had built the cage, and he had left me the key. Then I see the last line of the note. A final piece of the puzzle. P.S. There is one more thing. The S9 key is for this safe, but it is also for a file cabinet in the basement archives. The one marked S9. Their fate is documented on this drive. Yours is not. Your vindication is down there. Go get it. The drive home from the Northbridge Tower was a blur of rain-streaked headlights and the thrum of the engine. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in my small apartment. The city lights are distant, indifferent glitter outside my window, with my father's ghost and a black USB drive for company. The initial shock had receded, leaving behind something colder and harder. The grief was still there, a heavy anchor in my chest, but it was now entwined with a clear, sharp-edged purpose. I was no longer just a grieving daughter. I was an auditor, and I had just been handed the case file of my life. I booted up my personal laptop, the USB drive from the safe now securely plugged in. A copy of its contents was already saved to an encrypted folder. My father's instructions were my new Bible, but I needed to understand the context. I needed to connect their fraud to my own story. My uneven career, as Vivian might have called it, suddenly felt less like a series of personal missteps and more like a trail of carefully placed landmines. My first stop was my own email archive. I searched for Northbridge HR. The rejection email from 6 months ago popped up instantly. I remembered the sting of reading it the first time, the quiet humiliation. The key phrase was polished corporate speak. We have decided to pursue other candidates who are a better cultural fit at this time. Cultural fit. It was a meaningless, infuriatingly subjective barrier, impossible to argue against. But I wasn't interested in the official text. I was interested in the metadata, the digital breadcrumbs. I had a habit, born from years of auditing digital communications, of saving the full original versions of important emails. I opened the raw source file. It was mostly code, but buried in the header information, in the internal routing notes that were never meant to be seen externally, I found it. A comment appended by the HR director, as the rejection was processed. It was a single, chilling line, PVG flag for no hire. Her deep audit background in freight logistics equals significant institutional risk. VG Vivian Grant. There it was in black and white. It wasn't a conflict of interest. It was a risk assessment. My specific skill set, the very expertise I had spent a decade building, was identified as a threat. They didn't see a potential employee. They saw a potential investigator. They hadn't rejected my application. They had blacklisted a security threat. The next piece of the puzzle was Westwood Freight, my downsizing. I pulled up my termination letter dated April 14th. Then I opened a web browser and started digging through the society pages and photo archives of Ridgefield Oaks local publications. Vivian loved publicity, a weakness I could now exploit. I searched for her name, filtering by date, and there it was, an article from April 15th, the day after I was fired. In the Ridgefield Oaks Chronicle, the headline read, "Charity Luncheon a Sparkling Success." The article gushed about the fundraiser, and halfway down, a name caught my eye. The event's top sponsor was Westwood Freight, represented by its CFO, a man named Martin Geller. A quick search of the photo gallery from the event yielded the prize. A glossy picture of Vivian arm in arm with Geller, both of them laughing into the camera. The caption noted their shared table. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. A quiet word from a powerful woman at a charity luncheon. A casual mention of a problematic manager. A favor called in. It would have been that simple. My career was dismantled over cocktails and canapes, but they did more than just get me fired. They stole my work. I opened the video file from the USB drive again, Dane's optimized lane billing training session. I listened to his smug explanation of how to bill federal routes twice, by routing them through secondary hubs. My blood ran cold. It was a photocopy, a direct lift of the methodology I had uncovered and documented in my Kestrel audit at Westwood 5 years prior. That project had been my signature achievement, a complex fraud I had unraveled by identifying patterns in billing codes that everyone else had missed. They hadn't just feared my audit background. They had studied it. They had taken my intellectual property, my unique analytical fingerprint, and turned it into a blueprint for their own criminal enterprise. The anger was a clean, cold flame. Now, I needed to see how deep it went. My father's USB drive had another surprise. A file labeled NB_port_access. It contained a set of temporary login credentials to Northbridge's vendor management portal. A backdoor he had left open for me. I logged in. The interface was clunky, but I knew what I was looking for. I ran a search for Bridalhawk LLC. The vendor profile appeared on the screen. It was a masterclass in fabricated legitimacy, complete with a professional logo and a generic mission statement. I clicked on the Approval History tab. The digital log was precise and damning. The initial vendor application for Bridalhawk was submitted at 2:01 p.m. on a Tuesday, 2 years ago. The final approval, the one that onboarded them as a preferred supplier for high-value federal contracts, was logged at 2:10 p.m. the same day. The approving authority was listed as D. Grant. 9 minutes. It had taken Dane Grant 9 minutes to approve a vendor, who would go on to handle a $38 million a year portfolio. In a company like Northbridge, a legitimate vendor approval process for a contract of that size would take weeks, involving multiple levels of due diligence, financial checks, and compliance reviews. 9 minutes wasn't due diligence. It was the frantic rubber stamping of a pre-arranged conspiracy. I leaned back, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with brutal clarity. They feared my skills, so they had me fired. They stole my work to perfect their fraud. They used their power to fast-track a shell company into the heart of the corporate treasury. And all of it was leading to the grand prize. I went back to the PDF of Rider K, the supplier integrity clause. This time, I read it not as a daughter, but as the compliance manager they had been so afraid of. The language was my father's masterstroke. It was precise, legally airtight, and triggered by a single condition: upon the presentation of credible evidence of insider supplier fraud. Not a conviction, not a guilty verdict, just credible evidence. The spreadsheet, the video of Dane, Vivian's email, it was more than credible. It was a signed confession. The clause then detailed the consequence: all voting rights of the implicated parties shall be temporarily transferred to the pre-designated independent beneficiary. Independent beneficiary. The final critical piece was in the same folder. I found another document, Schedule Beneficiary.pdf. I opened it. It was a single page, a formal addendum to Rider K. It contained a single sentence and 2 signatures. The designated independent beneficiary for the purposes of Rider K is M. Cole, independent. Beneath it was my father's signature, and that of Thomas Marsh, acting as a legal witness. M. Cole, independent. He had thought of everything. By having me fired, by ensuring I was completely severed from both Westward and Northbridge, Vivian had inadvertently made me the perfect candidate for the role my father had created. I wasn't his daughter in this context. I was M. Cole, an unaffiliated third-party expert with a documented history in the exact type of fraud they were committing. My blacklisting wasn't a rejection. It was my final qualification. Now, only the timeline mattered. I went online to the Northbridge Investor Relations website. A press release issued just that morning announced the upcoming Board of Directors meeting. The agenda had one primary item: a vote to formally approve and execute a new 10-year federal logistics contract valued at $1.2 billion. The meeting was scheduled for 3 days from now. A separate search of the local event calendar confirmed my suspicions. Vivian wasn't waiting for the ink to dry. She had already booked the Crystal Ballroom at the Crestline Hotel for a champagne signing gala on the evening of the board meeting. It was to be her victory party. The public coronation of the Grant family as the undisputed rulers of my father's empire. She had set her own stage. She had no idea she had also set her own trap. I opened a new encrypted email client and composed a message. The recipient was Thomas Marsh. The message was 5 words: review Rider K before Crestline. I hit send. There was no turning back now. A strange calm settled over me. The chaotic swirl of grief, anger, and discovery had coalesced into a single, unyielding point of focus. My heart, which had been racing for the past 24 hours, slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat. It wasn't a frantic pulse of anxiety, it was a countdown. Each beat, a second closer to the moment the champagne would be served, and the perfect family would be brought to account. The next 48 hours were a blur of cold logic and calculated action. The grief was still a presence, a low hum beneath the surface, but I had no time for it. Grief could wait. Justice could not. My apartment transformed from a place of mourning into a war room. The floor and table covered with timelines, printouts, and diagrams. This was no longer about emotion. It was about execution. The first step was to protect the asset. My father's USB drive was the heart of the entire operation, and it could not be compromised. I spent 3 hours creating a series of encrypted, redundant backups, storing them on separate cloud servers, and 2 new physical drives. Then I walked into a downtown branch of First Harbor Bank, a small, independent institution where no one knew my name. Under a pseudonym, I rented a safe deposit box. The original Northbridge USB, the one with my father's masking tape label, was sealed in an anti-static bag and placed inside the cool, dark steel box. I walked out of the bank feeling a fraction lighter. The primary evidence was secure. The game was now in play. Next, I focused on the board, the battlefield. Northbridge Meridian's board of directors had 9 members. 2 were internal, Vivian, in her honorary but influential role, and Dane, the VP of operations. They were the targets. The other 7 were independent directors. The jury. I spent a full day dissecting their professional lives. I built a dossier on each one, pulling from public records, investor profiles, and industry publications. I mapped their connections, their past votes on contentious issues, their charitable affiliations. 3 of them, I noted, sat on charity boards that Vivian had chaired. They were compromised by social obligation, likely to side with her out of decorum. 2 others were corporate pragmatists, ruthless but fair, interested only in the bottom line and avoiding liability. They were my swing votes. But the key was the chairwoman, Rhea Maddox, a former federal prosecutor. She had a reputation for being surgically precise and intolerant of corporate malfeasance. She was an old-school operator who had been on the board longer than Vivian had been in the family. She was, I determined, my only viable entry point. Getting to her required a delicate touch. A formal request for a meeting would be flagged by Vivian's people instantly. Instead, I found a small cafe she frequented on Tuesday mornings before work. The next day, I was there, sitting at a small table near the door. When she walked in, I intercepted her at the counter. I kept it brief, my voice low and urgent. Ms. Maddox. My name is Murrin Cole, Harold Cole's daughter. Her eyes, a sharp, intelligent grey, assessed me instantly. I am sorry for your loss, Ms. Cole. Thank you, I said, cutting through the pleasantries. I need 30 seconds of your time. This is not about the will. This is about the federal contract. I leaned in slightly and dropped the 3 phrases I had rehearsed: Rider K, Federal Lanes. Crestline tonight. I watched her face for a reaction. There was no gasp, no look of shock, just an unnerving stillness. The gears were turning behind those prosecutors' eyes, connecting dots I could only guess at. She simply gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you for the coffee, Miss Cole, she said, and walked away. It wasn't a promise of help, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was an acknowledgement. I had her attention. To reinforce the message, I moved on to the next step, partial disclosure. I couldn't show my whole hand, but I had to give the board's legal counsel enough to make them pay attention. I compiled a small, curated sample of the evidence, a single-page excerpt of the payment logs to V-Grant Holdings, and a snippet of the server logs referencing the K flag Vivian had mentioned in her email. It was just enough to be alarming, but not enough to reveal the full scope of the fraud. I sealed the documents in 7 identical manila envelopes, using a bonded, anonymous courier service. I had them dispatched simultaneously to the 7 independent board members, and to the senior partner, at Northbridge's outside counsel, with a delivery confirmation requested for 5 p.m. The packages would land on their desks just 2 hours before the gala. With the board primed, I assembled my weapon. It took the form of an 8-slide presentation deck, built with the cold, brutal efficiency of a corporate execution. I kept the design stark, white background, black text, the Northbridge logo in the corner like a watermark on a death certificate. Slide 1, the title, Project Kestrel, an urgent governance matter. Slide 2, a timeline tracing the creation of Bridalhawk LLC to the final fraudulent invoice processed last week. Slide 3, a simple flowchart illustrating the movement of money from Northbridge through the shell company and into V-Grant Holdings. Slide 4, a high-resolution screenshot of Vivian's email. Her words, clear this before audit. Use K flag, blown up to fill half the page. Slide 5, featured the video of Dane. I embedded a 30-second clip cued to his smirking instruction. You're not paid to think. Just follow the procedure. Slides 6 and 7 displayed the full legal text of Rider K, with the crucial clause on the temporary transfer of voting rights highlighted in stark red. The final slide, number 8, was the addendum, my name designated as the independent beneficiary circled, M. Cole, independent. This presentation was my silver bullet. It was undeniable, data-driven, and stripped of all emotion. It was a story told in facts, figures, and their own damning words. Now I needed a venue. The Crestline Hotel was a fortress of soft carpets and polite security. Walking in unannounced was not an option. I called the hotel's event services. Posing as an assistant from Northbridge's AV department, I explained that there was a last-minute need for a small, private briefing for the board members before the main gala. With the right mix of corporate jargon and feigned urgency, I booked the Sycamore Suite, a small meeting room on the same floor as the Crystal Ballroom, for 6:30 p.m. The name on the booking was for the Kestrel briefing. With the board, the evidence, and the location secured, I messaged Thomas Marsh on a secure app. My instructions were precise. Tom, Sycamore Suite, Crestline Hotel, 6:30 p.m. sharp. Bring the sealed envelope titled Voting Trigger. That envelope, I knew, would contain the notarized legal document formalizing the execution of Rider K, the one he had witnessed my father sign. My final piece of preparation was my own access. I designed and printed a simple, professional-looking guest badge on high-quality cardstock. It had the Northbridge logo and the official event title. Beneath it, my name and a plausible title, Maureen Cole, Supplier Consultant. It was a perfect piece of corporate camouflage, bland enough to be invisible, official enough to pass a cursory check. In the final hour, standing in my apartment, I rehearsed my opening. I said the words aloud over and over, stripping them of any tremor, any hint of anger or grief, until they were as cold and hard as the steel key in my pocket. This is not grief speaking. It's evidence talking. 11 words, an indictment, and an instruction. I clipped the fake badge to the lapel of my simple dark blazer. Everything was in place. The evidence was secured. The jury was primed. The weapon was loaded. The lawyer was summoned. I glanced at my watch. 6:15 p.m. I took a deep breath, the air feeling strangely thin. I raised my wrist and set a vibrating alarm on my watch for 6:40 p.m., a 10-minute warning before the briefing was scheduled to begin. The soft click of the dial setting the time was the last sound in the quiet room. It was the final tumbler falling into place. The trap was set. The Crystal Ballroom at the Crestline Hotel was a symphony of calculated triumph. 100 tiny chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over everything, making the bubbles rising in countless flutes of champagne glitter like captured stars. The low hum of conversation was a carefully orchestrated mix of industry gossip, financial backslapping, and feigned intimacy. It was a room drowning in its own success, and at its center, holding court, was the architect of the evening's victory, Vivian. She was magnificent in a gown of midnight blue, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. She moved through the crowd, not as a hostess, but as a queen, accepting the fealty of her subjects. Her laughter, a bright, clear bell, signaling that all was right in her world. My world was the Sycamore Suite, a small, anonymous meeting room down a quiet corridor from the main ballroom. I slipped past the entrance to the gala. My supplier consultant badge earned me nothing more than a cursory nod from the security guard. As I passed, I nearly collided with Dane. He was radiant with reflected glory, his face flushed with champagne and arrogance. A new watch, a ludicrously expensive Swiss chronograph, gleamed on his wrist as he straightened his tie. He recognized me, and a slow, pitying smirk spread across his face. He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper laced with contempt. "Here to pick up the scraps, Morin," he murmured. He gestured with his flute toward the glittering ballroom, ready to watch us win. I said nothing. I just looked at him, my expression a blank wall he could not read. I held his gaze until his smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, before he scoffed and turned away, disappearing back into the golden light. Inside the Sycamore Suite, the air was cold and sterile. It was a room built for harsh realities, with a long polished table, 12 leather chairs, and a large dark monitor on the wall. I plugged my laptop into the presentation system and waited. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic vibration from the bass of the music in the ballroom next door. A muffled heartbeat counting down the seconds. The lawyer was summoned. I glanced at my watch. 6:28 p.m. I took a deep breath, the air feeling strangely thin. I raised my wrist and set a vibrating alarm on my watch for 6:40 p.m., a 10-minute warning before the briefing was scheduled to begin. The soft click of the dial setting the time was the last sound in the quiet room. It was the final tumbler falling into place. The trap was set. The Crystal Ballroom at the Crestline Hotel was a symphony of calculated triumph. 100 tiny chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over everything, making the bubbles rising in countless flutes of champagne glitter like captured stars. The low hum of conversation was a carefully orchestrated mix of industry gossip, financial backslapping, and feigned intimacy. It was a room drowning in its own success, and at its center, holding court, was the architect of the evening's victory, Vivian. She was magnificent in a gown of midnight blue, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. She moved through the crowd, not as a hostess, but as a queen, accepting the fealty of her subjects. Her laughter, a bright, clear bell, signaling that all was right in her world. My world was the Sycamore Suite, a small, anonymous meeting room down a quiet corridor from the main ballroom. I slipped past the entrance to the gala. My supplier consultant badge earned me nothing more than a cursory nod from the security guard. As I passed, I nearly collided with Dane. He was radiant with reflected glory, his face flushed with champagne and arrogance. A new watch, a ludicrously expensive Swiss chronograph, gleamed on his wrist as he straightened his tie. He recognized me, and a slow, pitying smirk spread across his face. He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper laced with contempt. "Here to pick up the scraps, Morin," he murmured. He gestured with his flute toward the glittering ballroom, ready to watch us win. I said nothing. I just looked at him, my expression a blank wall he could not read. I held his gaze until his smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, before he scoffed and turned away, disappearing back into the golden light. Inside the Sycamore suite, the air was cold and sterile. It was a room built for harsh realities, with a long polished table, 12 leather chairs, and a large dark monitor on the wall. I plugged my laptop into the presentation system and waited. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic vibration from the bass of the music in the ballroom next door. A muffled heartbeat counting down the seconds. Thomas Marsh arrived at 6:28 p.m., a slim leather portfolio in his hand. He gave me a single, steady nod and took a seat at the far end of the table, a silent, watchful ally. At precisely 6:30 p.m., the door opened. Rhea Maddox entered, her face as unreadable as a legal brief. She was followed by 3 other independent directors, a stern-faced retired general, and the 2 pragmatists I had identified as my swing votes. They had my couriered packages in their hands. There were no cameras, no PR handlers, no assistants. This was not a meeting. It was a tribunal. They closed the door behind them, and the muffled sound of the party vanished, leaving us in an unnerving, vacuum-sealed silence. They took their seats opposite me. Rhea placed her hands on the table, her gaze pinning me in place. There were no introductions, no small talk. The floor was mine. I stood up and pressed the button on the remote in my hand, bringing the large monitor to life. My first slide, the title page, filled the screen. "This is not grief speaking," I said, my voice even and clear, resonating in the quiet room. "It's evidence talking. Watch." As I finished the sentence, Thomas Marsh moved with quiet deliberation. He stood and placed a thick, sealed envelope on the table in front of Rhea Maddox. The words "voting trigger" were visible, typed in a stark black font. The soft thud of the envelope hitting the wood was like the cocking of a hammer. Then I began the presentation. I didn't speak a word. The evidence spoke for me. I let the timeline of the fraud sink in before moving to the flowchart of the money laundering scheme. I could see the pragmatists leaning forward, their eyes tracing the lines from Northbridge to the Shell Company. Then came Vivian's email. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the retired general as her directive to clear this before audit filled the screen. He recognized a criminal order when he saw one. Next, I played the video. Dane's smug, confident face filled the monitor. His voice, captured in perfect digital clarity, explained the mechanics of the fraud he had so cleverly named optimized lane billing. The room was utterly still. The only sound, the tiny audio from the monitor's speakers, condemning him with his own words. I watched Rhea Maddox. She didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change. She just watched. Her eyes narrowed, absorbing every frame, every word. It was the dispassionate, terrifying focus of a predator. I advanced to the final slide. The dry legal text of Rider K appeared. The clause regarding the temporary transfer of voting rights, highlighted in a blood-red box. My father's signature was at the bottom, a clear, defiant stroke of the pen. Next to it was the notary seal. I let the image hang in the room, the legal weight of it settling over the occupants. It was in that moment of profound silence that the door was thrown open. Vivian stood there, her face a thundercloud of rage. She had clearly noticed the absence of her most important board members, and come looking for them. Her eyes glittering with fury found me standing at the head of the table. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with indignation. She strode into the room, her regal composure shattered. "Who in God's name let you in here?" Her question was aimed at me, but it was Rhea who answered. The chairwoman didn't raise her voice. She didn't even turn fully in her chair. She simply looked at Vivian with a gaze as cold as a winter sea. "Vivian," she said, her voice dangerously soft. Sit down. The command, so quiet and yet so absolute, struck Vivian like a physical blow. The color drained from her face. In all her years, no one had ever spoken to her like that. Dane, who had followed her in, looked utterly bewildered. For a moment, Vivian seemed poised to argue, to unleash the full force of her legendary wrath. But something in Rhea's eyes stopped her. Defeated, she sank into the nearest empty chair, her magnificent gown pooling around her like a deflated balloon. With the targets now present, Thomas Marsh stood. He calmly broke the seal on the voting trigger envelope and slid out a single notarized document. He cleared his throat. Pursuant to the Northbridge Meridian corporate bylaws, and as stipulated in Rider K of the Master Supplier Agreement signed by the CEO, Honorary COO, and VP of Operations. He began, his voice the formal, inexorable sound of legal process. He then read the key passage aloud. Upon the presentation of credible evidence of insider supplier fraud, all voting rights held by the implicated parties, specifically their rights to vote on contractual matters and corporate governance, shall be temporarily and immediately transferred to the predesignated independent beneficiary, M. Cole, for a period of 90 days to ensure the integrity of the company. A short, sharp, incredulous laugh escaped Vivian's lips. This is insane, she sputtered, looking at Rhea for support. It's a ridiculous fantasy cooked up by a jealous child. You can't possibly take this seriously. She opened her mouth to continue, to tear apart this absurd, last-ditch effort by the daughter she had so thoroughly vanquished. But before she could form another word, Rhea Maddox spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a shard of glass. This meets the credible threshold. The words were a death sentence. Vivian's mouth snapped shut. The faint amusement on her face curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at Rhea, then at the other board members, their faces grim and unmoving. She had lost the room. She had lost control. And at that precise, devastating moment, the door to the Sycamore suite opened one last time. Two men in dark, impeccably tailored suits stood in the doorway. They were not hotel staff. They were the senior partners from Cromwell and Swain, Northbridge's outside counsel, the men who had received my anonymous packages. Their faces were stony, their eyes filled with the grim reality of damage control. One of them held a file, and his eyes found Vivian. The party next door was over. The golden light of the crystal ballroom seemed a world away. Here, in this cold, quiet room, the champagne had turned to ash. The air in the Sycamore suite grew thick and heavy, charged with the ozone of a lightning strike. The glittering party in the ballroom next door might, as well have been on another planet. Here, in this cold, quiet room, a kingdom was being dismantled, not with a bang, but with the dry rustle of legal papers. The two lawyers from Cromwell and Swain stepped fully into the room, their presence shifting the atmosphere from a mere corporate confrontation to a full-blown legal crisis. Rhea Maddox took command, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. This meeting of the Northbridge Meridian Board of Directors is now an emergency session, she declared, her authority absolute. Let the minutes reflect the time and location. The first order of business is the evidence presented by Ms. Murrin Cole concerning Rider K of the Master Supplier Agreement. She looked to the senior outside counsel, a man with silver hair and the weary eyes of someone who had navigated dozens of such disasters. Mr. Thorne, your assessment. Thorne stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Vivian and Dane as if they were specimens under a microscope. The evidence presented, he began, his tone grave and measured, is sufficiently credible to trigger the provisions of Rider K. The documents appear authentic. The video evidence is conclusive, and the financial data is deeply concerning. Our firm recommends the board act immediately to mitigate legal and financial exposure. I move to formally suspend all voting rights of Vivian Grant and Dane Grant pending the outcome of a full investigation, as stipulated in the rider. Rhea said, seconded. The retired general grunted. All in favor? Ria asked, her eyes on the independent directors. 5 hands went up. It was done. In less than a minute, Vivian and Dane had been rendered powerless, stripped of their authority in the company they thought they owned. The motion carries, Ria announced, her voice devoid of triumph. The second order of business is the activation of the beneficiary clause. The board formally recognizes Ms. Murrin-Cole as the independent proxy, holding the combined voting rights of Ms. Grant and Mr. Grant for a period of 90 days. The mandate is clear: to preserve the integrity of the federal contract negotiations and to act in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. She looked directly at me. Ms. Cole, do you accept this fiduciary responsibility? I met her gaze. I do, I said, my voice steady. It was the calmest I had felt in years. Then, as the first action under this new authority, I said, my voice filling the void, I table 3 resolutions. I slid a thin folder I'd prepared onto the table. First, I move that we immediately and indefinitely postpone the signing of the $1.2 billion federal contract. We will not proceed until a full, transparent audit has been completed. Second, I move that the board commission an independent third-party forensic accounting firm. I have a list of private candidates here to conduct a complete investigation into the Bridalhawk account and all associated vendor relationships. Third, I move that Vivian Grant be placed on a mandatory indefinite leave of absence and Dane Grant on administrative leave effective immediately. All access to company property, systems, and accounts is to be revoked pending the outcome of the investigation. Ria called for a vote on each resolution. Each time, my voice joined the 5 independent directors, a 6-vote supermajority that passed each motion instantly and irrevocably. That's when Dane finally broke. The veneer of calm arrogance shattered, and raw, entitled fury erupted in its place. He slammed his open palm down on the polished table, the sound making everyone flinch. This is a joke, he snarled, his face turning a blotchy red. He pointed a trembling finger at me. Who the hell are you to waltz in here and do this? You're nobody. You're a failed manager, who couldn't even hold a job. I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. She's the person your father chose. Dane, Ria said, her voice quiet, but carrying the force of a physical blow. The words sucked the air from his lungs. It wasn't me who had done this to him. It was his own stepfather, the man whose legacy he was so certain he was about to inherit. I ignored his outburst, letting Ria's words hang in the air. To ensure operational continuity on the affected federal lanes, I said, sliding a second folder across the table towards the board members, here is a list of alternative, private suppliers ready to be engaged on a temporary basis. Furthermore, I propose we immediately establish a publicly accessible, independently monitored whistleblower hotline. We need to send a clear message, effective today, that the culture that allowed this to happen is over. My actions, calm and procedural, were a more effective rebuttal than any argument. I wasn't just tearing things down. I was already rebuilding. The pragmatist directors nodded in approval, their faces showing a grudging respect. As we spoke, one of the lawyers had been typing furiously on his phone. He looked up at Ria and gave a slight nod. She glanced at her own phone, then addressed the room. A press release has just been issued to all major financial news outlets, she announced. It states, in part, that Northbridge Meridian Logistics is committed to the highest standards of transparency and corporate governance to ensure the complete integrity of the process and to safeguard taxpayer funds. The company has voluntarily postponed the signing of a major federal contract in order to conduct an immediate internal review. We are controlling the narrative. Just as she finished speaking, Vivian's phone, lying on the table beside her, began to vibrate. A low, angry buzz against the wood. The screen lit up. The caller ID was a private number, but the text preview beneath it was visible from across the table. It was from her private banker. Urgent. Call me. Credit facility for V. The corporate battle was one thing, but this was real. The money was gone. The fake consulting fees, the kickbacks, the river of stolen cash that funded her entire lifestyle. The tap had just been turned off. Dane was shaking his head, his eyes wide with a desperate denial. This isn't legal, he mumbled, more to himself than anyone else. You can't just take over a company based on some obscure clause. This is a sham. Thomas Marsh, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. He didn't say a word. He simply took the signature page from Ryder K and slid it across the table until it stopped directly in front of Dane. He then tapped one finger on Dane's own arrogant, self-important signature. The message was clear, you signed it. You agreed to this. This is a trap of your own making. I stood up, gathering my laptop and the now empty folders. The main battle was won. Now the long, grinding work of the war began. I looked at Vivian and Dane. Two monarchs suddenly stripped of their crowns. Their faces a mixture of shock, rage, and dawning terror. I felt no triumph, no surge of victorious joy, only a cold, quiet sense of finality. We'll finish this by the book, I said, my voice even. It was a promise to the board and a threat to them. I turned to leave. As I did, I caught my reflection in the dark, blank screen of the large monitor on the wall. For a disorienting second, the image was distorted by the overhead lights, and I thought I saw another figure standing behind me. Taller, broader, a faint and ghostly silhouette of my father. It was just a trick of the light, a projection of my own exhaustion and emotion. But in that fleeting moment, it felt like an affirmation, a silent nod of approval from the man who had laid all the plans. I was not just his daughter. I was his executive, and the work had just begun. The adrenaline of the confrontation at the crest line carried me for hours, a cold, clean fire of purpose. But as I rode the elevator down into the belly of the North Bridge Tower in the dead of night, a profound exhaustion began to settle deep in my bones. The emergency board session had lasted until midnight, a brutal marathon of legal maneuvering and damage control. Vivian and Dane had been escorted from the hotel by security, their reign ending not with a bang, but with a quiet, humiliating exit through a service corridor. Now, there was one last piece of my father's puzzle left to find. The elevator doors opened onto the basement level, and the air changed. The filtered, climate-controlled atmosphere of the upper floors gave way to something older, heavier. It was cool down here, with the faint, telltale scent of damp concrete, aging paper, and ozone from the humming server racks behind a nearby cage. A long corridor stretched out before me, lined with heavy metal doors. My footsteps echoed in the stillness. A single row of fluorescent lights flickered overhead, each one emitting a low, incessant buzz that vibrated in my teeth. I found the door I was looking for, B13 Records Archive. The heavy steel key, the one marked S9, slid into the industrial lock. It turned with a heavy grating sound, like a machine stirring from a long slumber. The door swung inward, revealing a cavernous room filled with rows upon rows of grey metal filing cabinets. It was a library of corporate history, a mausoleum of dead deals and forgotten memos. I found the cabinet in the far corner, a label maker tag stuck to the top drawer, S9. The key worked here, too. The drawer slid open with a squeal of metal on metal. It wasn't filled with hanging files as I'd expected. Instead, it was packed with 3 cardboard banker's boxes. The lid secured with yellowing packing tape. My father's familiar, blocky handwriting was on the side of each one. The top box was labeled Audits, Kestrel. My breath hitched. This was it. I lifted the box out and set it on the dusty floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. I sliced the tape with my key and lifted the lid. The box was filled with a set of leather-bound notebooks, the kind my father always used. I opened the first one. It was a journal, not of his life, but of his company's slow poisoning. Page after page was filled with his meticulous notes documenting his suspicions about Vivian's financial dealings. He had been reverse engineering her fraud for years. He'd made flowcharts of the kickback schemes, noted discrepancies in the expense accounts she controlled, and detailed how she had standardized supplier commissions, a bland corporate term for the system she used to skim millions. He had been running a silent, one-man internal investigation, right under her nose. At the bottom of the box, beneath the notebooks, I found a thin, sealed manila folder. It felt different from the rest, heavier. I opened it. Inside were documents that had nothing to do with Northbridge finances, and everything to do with my father's life. The first was a single sheet of pale blue stationery, yellowed with age, folded in thirds. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was delicate, familiar, and it hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was my mother's. The letter was dated 2 weeks before she died and a full year before my father married Vivian. "Harold," it began. "I know you are lonely, and I know this woman, Vivian, is a comfort to you, but you must be careful. I have met her only twice, but I see a hunger in her that has nothing to do with love. It is a hunger for what you have built. She does not see you. She sees a prize to be won. Do not let your grief blind you to her nature. Do not let her erase what we were." I had to sit down on the cold concrete floor, the letter trembling in my hands. All this time, I had seen my father's marriage to Vivian as a weakness, a foolish mistake made in the fog of grief. But my mother had seen it coming. She had warned him. He had read these words, and he had married her anyway. The tragedy of his choice, the weight of the secret he had carried all these years, was crushing. Tucked behind my mother's letter was another document, a legal agreement, a prenuptial contract. It had been torn almost in half, a jagged rip running down the middle, as if someone had tried to destroy it in a fit of rage, but the most important section was still perfectly legible. A single, powerful clause stood out: all corporate assets, shares, and controlling interests of Northbridge Meridian Logistics, and any successor entities, shall remain the separate and sole property of Harold T. Cole, not subject to division as marital property under any circumstances. Vivian's entire claim to the company, the foundation of her power, was built on sand. She may have been his wife, but legally, she was never his partner. Beneath that was another document, a draft of a will dated nearly 10 years ago. It was never signed, an early version long since superseded. I scanned the pages, and my eyes landed on a familiar phrase. He had laid out a contingency plan for a crisis of ethical leadership, and in it, he named a safe beneficiary to assume temporary control. The name typed into the blank space was mine. 10 years ago. He had been planning this, thinking of me in this exact role for a decade, my entire career, my reputation for integrity, my eventual independence from the company. He hadn't just used my circumstances. He had been waiting for them to align with a plan he had laid out long ago. And then I saw the photograph. It was tucked inside the pages of the drafted will, a small, faded Polaroid. It was me, a gawky teenager with braces, standing next to him in front of a chain-link fence. Behind us was a field of shipping containers, the very first Northbridge yard. My father's arm was around my shoulder. He was younger, his face tanned and lined from the sun. His work shirt stained with something that might have been grease. He looked tired, but he was smiling. And his eyes, when he looked at me, were full of an unguarded, uncomplicated pride. It was the man he was before Vivian, before the minimalist mansion and the silk ties, the man who smelled of diesel and salt. My dad holding that small square photograph, surrounded by the evidence of his silent, lonely war. I finally understood. My father wasn't weak. He wasn't a fool blinded by a beautiful woman. He was a strategist who had found himself in an unwinnable battle on one front, his marriage, and had decided to sacrifice it to win the war for his company. He had let Vivian have the house, the social status, the illusion of control. He had endured the quiet humiliation, the slow erosion of his own home, all while secretly building a firewall around the company he had created from nothing. He wasn't protecting his marriage. He was protecting his life's work. He was protecting me. There was one last file in the box, a thin folder containing a series of printed emails. They documented a chain of communication between Vivian and a senior IT manager. Vivian's instructions were clear. At the end of every fiscal quarter, he was to perform a deep scrub of the server logs associated with the K-flag accounting codes, permanently deleting them. But at the bottom of the last page, my father had added a handwritten note in red ink. Standard procedure, but she doesn't know the system automatically spools a complete, undeletable archival copy to tape archive 03. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made me jump. It was just after 2 a.m. A man in a suit, the lead investigator from the forensic accounting firm the board had hired, stood in the doorway. "Miss Cole," he said, his voice quiet. I stood up, brushing the dust from my clothes. "It's all here," I said, my voice. "Everything you'll need for the next half hour." We worked in silence. I formally handed over the boxes from the S9 cabinet, along with the original USB drive, which Thomas Marsh had retrieved from the bank for me. We logged every notebook, every file. At 2:11 a.m., I signed the bottom of a chain of custody form, a simple procedural act that felt like closing a chapter of a book that had been open my entire life. The investigator and his team stayed behind to begin their work. I left them there in the buzzing fluorescent light of the basement. I didn't take the elevator. I took the stairs, my hand trailing along the cool, painted concrete wall. With each step upward, I felt the immense weight of my father's secret life settling into a new shape. It was no longer a burden of confusion and resentment, but a legacy of quiet, painful, and heroic sacrifice. Halfway up the empty stairwell, I stopped. The silence was absolute. "I get it now, Dad. I get it." The morning sun sliced through the blinds of my father's office, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I hadn't slept. I had been here at the Northbridge Tower since leaving the basement archives. The office felt like a museum, a perfectly preserved diorama of my father's life, and now it was my temporary command center. The silence of the pre-dawn hours had given way to a low, frantic hum of activity throughout the building. The coup was complete. Now came the consolidation of power and the public fallout. At 9 a.m. sharp, I stood beside Rhea Maddox at a podium in the corporate press room. The space was packed, a chaotic sea of cameras, microphones, and anxiously looking journalists. The air crackled with the energy of a scandal breaking in real time. Rhea gave a brief, steely introduction, her presence a bulwark of stability. Then she gestured to me. I stepped up to the microphone, the glare of the camera lights hot and white. I looked out at the expectant faces and delivered the statement I had written an hour before. It was 43 seconds long. Good morning. In my capacity as a temporary fiduciary for Northbridge Meridian Logistics, I am here to confirm that the board has voted to postpone the signing of the pending federal contract. This decision was made to allow for a comprehensive internal review of our supplier integrity protocols, a process we are initiating immediately with the help of an independent third-party firm. Northbridge is and will remain fully committed to the highest standards of corporate governance and transparency. Our operational commitments to our existing clients are unaffected. We will have no further comment at this time. Thank you. I stepped back. A barrage of questions erupted from the floor, a cacophony of reporters shouting over one another. One voice, a sharp-witted journalist from a major financial paper, cut through the noise. Ms. Cole, what is your personal relationship to this situation, and what qualifies you for this fiduciary role? I stepped forward again, my expression unchanging. I am the daughter of the man who signed Rider K into the company's bylaws, I said, my voice clear and even, carrying over the din. I am acting according to the text. That is my only qualification, and my only relationship to this matter. And with that, Rhea and I turned and walked off the stage, leaving a room full of reporters with 1,000 new questions, and only one deeply unsatisfying answer. The market's reaction was immediate and violent. The news hit the wire services with the headline, Northbridge halts $1.2 billion federal deal amid governance review. CEO's daughter assumes proxy control. I watched on a monitor in the office as our stock ticker turned blood red, plummeting 7% in the first 20 minutes of trading. It was the predictable, panicked response of the algorithm-driven market. But then the countercurrent began. A note from a highly respected Wall Street analyst flashed across the screen. Northbridge Board's decisive governance first move is painful, but necessary medicine, a bold step towards long-term stability. By noon, two major institutional investors, massive pension funds that held millions of our shares, had issued public statements commending the board's commitment to transparency and ethical oversight. The stock stabilized, then began to slowly claw back its losses. We had taken a body blow, but we had also demonstrated that the company was strong enough to excise its own cancer. While Wall Street reacted with numbers, the justice system reacted with action. News crews, tipped off by the press conference, had descended on a drab, anonymous office park in the suburbs. It was the listed address for V. Grant Holdings. Live television broadcast, the quiet, methodical raid. Men and women in dark suits with badges from the state's Financial Crimes Unit were filmed carrying sealed document boxes out of a small second-floor office. Then Vivian's black sedan pulled up. She emerged, dressed for a board meeting, not a criminal investigation. The swarm of reporters was instant and overwhelming. She looked stunned, hunted, her face hidden behind oversized black sunglasses, as her lawyer tried to shove a path through the throng of cameras. She said nothing, her silence a stark contrast to the confident queen of the gala just 12 hours earlier. Dane's reaction was less disciplined. At 1:15 p.m., a tweet appeared from his personal account. A burst of impotent digital rage. We will fight these lies and smears, a hostile takeover by a bitter, washed-up family member. The truth will prevail. 3 minutes later, the tweet was deleted. It was a digital scream of defiance followed by the humiliating silence of a lawyer's frantic phone call. The screenshot, of course, was already everywhere. The pressure intensified. The outside counsel, acting on behalf of the board, sent a formal proffer letter to the newly retained, high-priced legal teams representing Vivian and Dane. The terms were brutally simple. Option A, full and complete cooperation with the internal investigation, including a detailed accounting of the V. Grant Holdings entity. In exchange, the board would recommend leniency to the district attorney. Option B, obstruction, denial, and litigation. In that event, the board would hand over the entirety of its findings and recommend immediate criminal prosecution for wire fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. They were given 48 hours to choose between disgrace and prison inside Northbridge. The memo announcing the new whistleblower hotline had gone out to all 5,000 employees. The response was not a trickle, it was a flood. The independent firm managing the hotline reported 12 credible, detailed anonymous submissions within the first 24 hours. Employees who had been silenced by fear for years were now speaking out. They corroborated the double billing scheme. They identified 2 other ghost vendors I hadn't even known about. They detailed a pattern of intimidation and harassment within Dane's operations division. The rot was deeper than my father had even suspected, and now it was all coming into the light. Amidst the chaos, I focused on my mandate to stabilize the company. Sitting at my father's vast mahogany desk, I signed the official resolution terminating Northbridge's relationship with Bridalhawk LLC, permanently barring them from our systems. A minute later, I countersigned an emergency contract with a reputable carrier from the list I had prepared, ensuring the federal shipping lanes would experience zero disruption. The message to our clients and the government was clear: the business of Northbridge continues, but it will no longer be business as usual. Just as I put the pen down, Thomas Marsh entered the office. He placed a single document on the desk in front of me. It was the final page of the minutes from last night's emergency meeting, the one that documented the transfer of power. Voting trigger executed, for the official record, he said quietly. I picked up my pen again. I signed my name, Murrin Cole, beneficiary, fiduciary, on the line. My hand did not shake. The ink flowed, dark and permanent. It was done. The power was legally and officially mine. As Marsh turned to leave, my phone began to ring, its sharp chime cutting through the quiet of the office. I didn't recognize the number, but the exchange was for the firm Kellen and Marsh. I answered. M. Cole, this is Stephen Kellen. The voice on the other end said, given the recent and extraordinary developments regarding the governance of Northbridge Meridian, we believe it is in the best interest of the estate to proceed with the reading of your father's last will and testament without delay. I understand, I said. When were you thinking? We have an opening at 3 o'clock this afternoon, he said. Here at our offices. Will that be acceptable? Today, in less than 2 hours. Yes, I said, my voice steady. I'll be there. The conference room at Kellen and Marsh was a vacuum. Sound seemed to die the moment it was born, absorbed by the thick carpet, the heavy mahogany table, and the rows of leather-bound legal books that had witnessed 1,000 such endings. It smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and the sterile, metallic scent of money-changing hands. The late afternoon sun cast long, accusatory stripes of light across the table, illuminating the fine layer of dust on its otherwise perfect sheen. We sat in a triangle of silent hostility. Vivian was at the far end of the table, a statue carved from ice and fury. Her back was ramrod straight. Her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She stared at a point on the wall just over my head, her expression a mask of contemptuous boredom that failed to conceal the frantic, terrified energy churning beneath the surface. Dane sat to my left, a collapsed version of his former self. He was slumped in his chair, his expensive suit looking suddenly too big for him. He stared intently at the polished toes of his Italian shoes, as if they held the answer to how his entire world had disintegrated in less than a day. And then there was me. I sat opposite them, a file from the morning's work resting on the table before me. I felt a strange and unsettling calm, the kind that follows a devastating storm. At precisely 3 p.m., Stephen Kellen entered the room. He was a tall, stooped man in his 60s. His face a road map of other people's troubles. He gave a single, cursory nod to the room and sat at the head of the table, opening a thick, blue-bordered document with a soft rustle of paper. He cleared his throat. We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Harold T. Cole, he began. His voice a dry, emotionless drone. He didn't look at any of us. His focus was entirely on the text before him, a priest reading from a sacred, unalterable scripture. For the next 10 minutes, he recited the mundane architecture of a wealthy man's death, debts to be settled, charitable bequests to be made, minor personal effects to be distributed. I listened to the dispassionate cataloguing of my father's life. His collection of maritime maps was to be donated to a local museum. His vintage watch was to go to his brother, Robert. A series of small cash gifts were designated for long-serving employees. It was all neat, so orderly. A life reduced to a list of assets. Regarding the primary personal properties, Kellen continued, his voice never changing in inflection. The residence located at 450 Lake Variety Road, including all of its contents, is bequeathed to my wife, Vivian Grant. Vivian did not react. It was her house. The assets contained within the pre-established Grant Family Trust, as defined in the attached schedule, are to be transferred in full to my stepson, Dane Grant, upon his 35th birthday. Dane didn't look up, but his shoulders seemed to relax a fraction. His money was safe. The trust his mother had ensured my father set up years ago was untouched. He would still be rich, even if he was disgraced. For a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of the old smugness return to his posture. They were down, but not out. They had lost the company, but they would keep the spoils. Kellen turned a page. The crisp sound of the paper was unnaturally loud in the silent room. He paused, a small, almost imperceptible hesitation in the rhythm of his reading. He looked up from the document for the first time, his pale, lawyerly eyes passing over Vivian, over Dane, and then landing on me. The air in the room grew thin. The pressure changed. This was it, the final move. When he spoke again, his voice was different. It was still formal, but it carried a new and terrible weight. Regarding the disposition of all corporate assets, he said, his gaze fixed on me, specifically my controlling shares and all associated voting rights in the entity known as Northbridge Meridian Logistics and any and all of its subsidiaries. He paused again, letting the words hang in the air. Vivian's head slowly turned, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. My personal assets having been addressed separately, he continued, the corporate authority is a matter of corporate governance, not personal inheritance. He read directly from the page now, his voice clear and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. The mechanism for this governance is already in place. It is my final and irrevocable directive that the controlling provision, as defined and executed within Rider K of the Master Supplier Agreement, be made permanent. He took a slow breath. Therefore, all voting rights representing the founder's controlling interest in Northbridge Meridian Logistics shall, in any and all situations involving an ethical or legal crisis, as defined in said rider, be transferred in perpetuity to the designated independent beneficiary, Marin Cole. This directive is to be considered effective retroactive to the date of the signing of Rider K. The silence that followed was a physical thing, a crushing weight that sucked the very air from the room. Then chaos. Vivian shot to her feet with a strangled cry of pure, animalistic rage. Her chair scraped violently against the floor and then crashed over backwards. The sound like a gunshot in the funereal quiet. No, she shrieked, her voice a roar, ugly tear in the fabric of the room. He wouldn't. It's a lie. He would never. Her words devolved into a choked, sputtering incoherence. As she stood there, trembling, a small, clear sound cut through her rage. It was the soft, metallic jingle of the keys in my pocket as I shifted in my seat. 3 keys on a simple steel ring. The key to the 51st floor, the S9 key, and the key to the Kestrel project. It wasn't a loud sound, but in that moment of shattered silence, it sounded like a final, damning judgment bell. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the cold, hard reality of the keys. I didn't brandish them. I just held them for a moment before placing them back in my pocket. The movement slow and deliberate. I stood up. I looked at Vivian's contorted face, at Dane's utterly broken expression, as he stared into the abyss of his final, complete defeat. I felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness. The war was over. We are done here, I said, my voice quiet, but it carried across the room with absolute finality. I picked up my file from the table. I didn't look back at them. I turned and walked towards the door. As I opened it, the late afternoon light flooded into the hallway, a brilliant, cleansing gold. It fell across the cover of the file in my hands, illuminating the bold, block letters of the title I had printed that morning, Northbridge Meridian Ethics. First, I stepped out of the dark, silent room, and into the light. The heavy door swung shut behind me. The click of the latch, a definitive final seal. My footsteps, the steady, rhythmic tap of my heels on the marble floor, echoed in the empty corridor, the only sound in a world that was suddenly mine. I did not look back. The story has concluded. The story has concluded.